Let's see if I'm on the screen now. All right. Well, thank you, Caitlin, for introducing me here. It's exciting to be part of Global Entrepreneurship Week. I know this has been a very long-running event. That's pretty awesome. For those of you who don't know me, oops. My name is Chris Brown. I own Venture Legal, which is a law firm that supports startups, freelancers, and small businesses with transactional needs, contracts, lease agreements, and corporations, and so on. And I'm also the founder of Contract Canvas, which is an online contract and e-signature platform for creative professionals. We launched that earlier this year. It's an interesting year to launch a business, but I can just say that, there's never a perfect time to launch a business. At some point, you just have to make the jump, which I think is probably why most of you are tuning in here to this presentation. But anyway, with Contract Canvas, freelancers, creative professionals go on there, create contracts. They're designed for humans, not lawyers. And then they can sign them with their clients on the internet. So it's just kind of a new way of doing things. Anyway, I have a huge interest in entrepreneurship. All of my clients are entrepreneurs in some fashion or another. And I myself am also an entrepreneur. Before we get too far, I have to give the legal disclaimer because I am a lawyer, but I'm not your lawyer. So this session here obviously is not confidential, but if you have questions, I would love for you to post them in the chat box there, and then they get relayed back to me via a separate document, and I can answer them kind of as we're going through. And then obviously this is not legal advice. Everything I'm saying here today is general in nature. And before you rely on anything in particular, you should probably go talk to a lawyer, preferably one that's licensed in your state. And actually, I should have asked, I'm presuming most of you are here in Kansas City, or at least Kansas and Missouri. That's what this presentation is going to focus on. And here's an outline of what we're going to go through. So we're going to talk about starting an LLC, as well as kind of a little bit about starting corporations. But since the vast majority of you are likely to start a LLC and not a corporation, we're going to spend most of our time talking about LLCs. We're going to talk a little bit about business, finance, and taxes. And then I'll just kind of give you a random sampling of practical business thoughts, things about insurance, contracts, non-disclosure agreements, and so on. But I just want to emphasize, if you have a question about something I'm talking about, go ahead and throw it out there when I'm on that topic, because it's easiest just to address it right then and there, as opposed to coming back to it later. At the end, there should be plenty of time for Q&A though. So if anybody wants to ask a question at that point, you certainly can. So the first question that always comes up with people, clients, and in particular freelancers, people that are starting a business on their own. And I got to say that in 2020, I've seen an explosion of people who are creating businesses on their own, freelancers, independent contractors, consultants, whatever you want to call it. And I think the reason is lots of people have been laid off, unfortunately. Lots of people have been reduced hours and so on. And so for all these various reasons, people are saying, wow, I really should just start my own business. And it's awesome. So if you're a sole proprietor, or I'm sorry, if you're a freelancer, like an individual who wants to go out and start your own business, you're basically going to look at this and say you can be a sole proprietor, partnership, or an LLC, right? And the same thing applies for 2 or more people. So if you and your friend want to start a business, you're still going to be looking at these same options. It's just you won't have sole proprietorship as an option because there's 2 of you or 3, whatever. In which case you're going to be looking at partnership and LLCs. So there's a lot of reasons why you would want to form an LLC. The biggest reason being that white box that I've drawn around that little cafe there. If you start a business as a sole proprietor or a partnership is like a sole proprietorship, but just 2 people or 3 or 4 instead of 1. What happens is you're personally liable for everything that happens through that business. So if you take out a loan, you sign a commercial lease agreement, you sign contracts with your clients, with your subcontractors, you do whatever. You are personally liable for everything that happens through that business. And when I say personal liable, what I mean is people can sue you. And if they get a judgment, they can put liens on your house, on your car. They can take your assets. They can garnish your wages. They can do all these things that are really nasty. So for that reason, I usually counsel people to form an LLC or a corporation. And that's that one there on the side. That white box there, the reason I put that there is because it's a way to indicate that the owners, so that those 2 people up there, are isolated. They're protected. They have limited liability for the debts and obligations of the company. So what happens there is, if say you open up a cafe, that's what the image is, and a barista serves coffee to somebody, it's too hot. There's a famous lawsuit at McDonald's about this. Anyway, the barista serves coffee to somebody, it's too hot, burns their lips, customer sues the restaurant. gets a judgment, right? They could also sue the owners of that business. But because you have that limited liability that you get from a corporation or an LLC, the owners can claim that they get that limited liability protection and should not be personally liable for the lawsuit, the debts and obligations that are coming through that lawsuit. That's a way to shield yourself from personal liability for company debts and obligations. Now, there are certainly exceptions to this. There's a doctrine called piercing the corporate veil. So if you're just creating an LLC as a scam and you're fraudulent, a court can pierce that. If you sign a personal guarantee on a lease, for example, or anything for that matter, then you can be personally liable. But generally speaking, you will not be personally liable for everything that happens through the company. So that's why it's usually a good idea to form an LLC or a corporation to prohibit your personal assets from being attacked by people who have claims against your company. There are, of course, a lot of questions about whether or not you should form an LLC or a corporation. And I mean, this is a super deep topic, but the general idea that I think is worth conveying here today is that if you're going to be like a venture-backed startup, you're raising professional money, you have aspirations of going public, you probably want to be a corporation because corporations have better flexibility for stock ownership and things like that. But only about 2 or 3% of businesses raise any kind of venture capital at all. The vast majority of businesses will never raise money like that. They might take out a bank loan or credit cards or whatever, but they're not likely to take out venture capital. So for that reason, a lot of businesses choose to be an LLC. The reason is LLCs are a lot more flexible. You can have different types of management structures, ownership structures, pass through taxes. There's a bunch of advantages to being an LLC. So for the most part, LLCs are the preferred route for most businesses today, but there are some exceptions to that. And I'll quickly note too, if you're starting a business and you think maybe in the future someday you might want to raise money, so you think you might need to be a corporation, you can still start an LLC today because it's super cheap, super fast. And then if things are still working, 6 months, 12 months or whatever, and you get to a point where you're actually ready to close around, you can always convert into a corporation. You can even convert into a Delaware C Corp, which is a whole different topic. You can change between the two. So for that reason, I usually recommend you start out as an LLC. Somebody asked, is an LLC meant to limit your liability? And that's correct. That's what I was talking through just a second ago. I don't know when that topic or that question came through, but yes, by forming an LLC, you get limited liability, right? That's why it's called a LLC, a limited liability company. You get the same limited liability through LLCs and through corporations. And actually, I should say too, for anybody who's thinking about freelancing, who's going to be by yourself, so you've got these options if you can be a sole proprietor or an LLC. There's a lot of reasons to choose to be an LLC. If you're signing a commercial lease agreement, if you're signing contracts with clients, and probably most important, if you are hiring subcontractors or employees to provide services to your end client, using an LLC is a great way to isolate your liability. It's really not that hard to form, as we'll get into here in a few minutes. It's not very expensive. So even if you're a freelancer, which myself, I'm actually a freelancer. I'm a solo lawyer, which is a fancy way of saying freelancer. You should be an LLC. I chose to be an LLC on day one. It's just kind of a no-brainer in my opinion. So here's how you actually do it. And I'm going to focus on LLCs, but keep in mind that forming a corporation is going to be extremely similar to this same process here. So somebody asked about taxation of LLCs. I'll come back to that here in a few minutes. I'm going to dive deep into taxes, which it's 2 o'clock on a beautiful Tuesday afternoon. I'm sure you're all excited to talk about taxes, but we'll come back to taxes in a few minutes. So if you want to create an LLC, you go to your Secretary of State website, or you can do it by paper, but most people do it online nowadays. So Missouri, Kansas, both of them are the same. Go to their website, create an account, and you file what's called Articles of Organization. A corporation would file Articles of Incorporation, which is a pretty similar document, but a little bit different. But anyway, you can file this online. If you're in Kansas, they charge $160. If you're in Missouri, they charge $50. And you can form it anywhere in the country. You can form it in Delaware, you can form it in Montana, Nevada, Florida, whatever. But normally you will form it in the state in which you live and operate. Interestingly, here in Kansas City, we get to pick between Kansas and Missouri. They're generally speaking going to be about the same, but if you live and work in one state in particular, I would just form there. It's a lot easier. You might form in Delaware if you think you're going to be a venture backed company. But if you do that, you might as well form a corporation. And the reason for that is Delaware has very business friendly laws. Their Secretary of State is fairly easy to work with. The vast majority, I'd probably guess about 90% or more of the Fortune 500 companies are incorporated in Delaware. It's just generally where you'd want to be if you're going to be venture backed. But for the other 98% of you that are not raising funds, you're generally better off being in the state where you're doing business. So you file that form, and you have to designate a registered agent. And at the end of the day, a registered agent is just basically the person or the company that will accept lawsuits on behalf of your new company. It has to be an actual address. It cannot be a PO box. I think you might be able to use like a UPS store box or something, but I would really advise against that. You really want to make it an address that you will be at, generally speaking, between 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. So generally speaking, I would use your office. If you don't have an office, you can use your home address. If you don't want to use your home address, or if you don't want to, or if you just don't want to serve at all, you can pay a company to serve for you, and they'll charge you anywhere from $100 to a few $100s a year to serve for you. And that's what I do. I work out of a co-working office. Actually, right now I'm working out of my house, but normally I'm out of a co-working office downtown, and I really trust the staff there. But if my law firm gets sued, that's a really big deal. So I actually pay a company called Northwest Registered Agent to serve as my agent, just to make sure that that lawsuit doesn't get slip through the cracks. So far in 10 years, I haven't been sued. Hopefully, knock on wood, I don't get sued. But anyway, that's the purpose of a registered agent, and you have to have it. Now, if you're going to use a name different than your legal name, then you have to get what's called a DBA, doing business as, or a fictitious name. So I'll take myself as an example. My LLC is called Venture Legal LLC. I use the name Venture Legal in all of my marketing. It's here on my slide. It's my website and everything. So I don't need to register a DBA. But let's just say that I wanted to be Widget Co. I wanted to use that name in marketing for some reason. In that case, I'd have to register my fictitious name, in that case, Widget Co., with the Secretary of State. Some states don't have a DBA database, like Kansas doesn't have one for some reason. Missouri does, and it's super easy to file this. You just go on their website, fill out the form. It takes like 5 minutes. It costs, I think, $7. It's a pretty simple form. But generally speaking, I like to tell people don't create an LLC with one name if you're going to use a different name in marketing, unless you have some really good reason for doing that. You might have a holding company, or you might have different like subsidiary assets or products that you offer people. Like there are reasons to do that, but generally speaking, it's easier just to use your LLC name in your marketing and publicly facing. And then the last thing here is get an EIN from the IRS. I cannot copy and paste the URL because it's just too long, but if you Google EIN online, the first link is almost always the IRS's online website. You go there, answer a bunch of questions, and you'll get your EIN. An EIN is your employer identification number. And even if you don't have employees, it's important to have an EIN because this is kind of like a social security number for a business, in the sense that you can use it to identify your business with government entities, with clients, and so on. So you'll put it on forms that you give to clients. You'll use it with the IRS for sure. I think you even use it with state departments of revenue and so on. It's just something you pretty much have to have. Some of those questions in the form are confusing, to be honest. I normally get them for my clients when I create LLCs and corporations for them. My clients usually work with an accountant, and those accountants can also get it for them. But to be honest, you feasibly could work your way through that yourself. I think, yeah, this is a good spot to pause. I'm seeing a bunch of questions pop up, so I'm going to answer those now before I go forward. Is it easy to transition from an LLC to a corporation? Kind of. It depends. There's a million factors that go into that. Most likely, the only reason you would change from an LLC to a corporation is if you're raising money. Trying to think if there's any other great reasons. That's the only one that comes to mind. And if you're raising money, I mean, even if it's a small round, like 50 grand or something, well, if you were raising 50 grand, you probably want to convert. But if you raised $500,000 or $1 million, you'd probably convert. and you're looking at a few $1,000s of legal fees to do that. I mean, it could be more, but it's not that hard to convert. But I'll say this. Um, Lots of people are trying to raise money, but don't ever get to that milestone for various reasons. And if you don't raise money, an LLC is often much easier than a corporation. So I still like the idea of starting it as an LLC unless you have money, investment money coming in the door almost immediately. Somebody said, I'm sorry, what's a registered agent? Long story short, it's where lawsuits get mailed. I covered that a lot. I think these will be recorded and rebroadcast later. So you can probably just watch that later, but you can also Google what is a registered agent. But in short, it's where lawsuits get mailed. So you have to make sure you have one because the state requires it. And you want to make sure it's one that you actually are at. You don't want to use a fake address there. Oh yeah, somebody answered. I don't know if everybody can see that answer or not, but somebody named JW answered that registered agents are basically the person who would be served with a lawsuit, and that's correct. Okay, moving on. After you create the company, get your EIN, file your DBA, do all that regulatory stuff, you need to draft what's called an operating agreement. If you are a corporation, you would not draft an operating agreement. You would draft bylaws and most likely a shareholder agreement. But for LLCs, it's an operating agreement. And in both cases, corporations and LLCs, you'll want to cover as much stuff as you possibly can. You don't need a 100-page operating agreement. Most likely you don't. But a one-page operating agreement is probably not good either. If it's just one person, you can often get by with just 2 or 3 pages because you don't need to cover much stuff. But as soon as you get 2 people or more, you pretty much need to go through all these various what-if scenarios. So I'm talking about things like voting and management rights. Who gets to make decisions on behalf of the company? Who gets to hire people? Who gets to sign commercial lease agreements? Who gets to shut the company down? You need to talk about economic rights and obligations. Is there an obligation to contribute more money to the company? What rights do people have to take money out of the company? How are you going to allocate profits and losses? So all those economic rights need to be spelled out in the agreement. It's usually a good idea to have transfer restrictions. What I mean by this is the transfer of your ownership interest. So usually an operating agreement will say that the owners cannot sell their ownership interest to any third party unless there's some kind of an exception. The exceptions being like estate planning, if you have a trust, or the other exception being a right of first refusal. So oftentimes it would say, both of us, we cannot sell our ownership interest, but I can sell it if I offer it to you first on the same terms that this other person out here agreed to purchase it. Sometimes it's really great. Sometimes it's really not great. It kind of depends on the dynamics of the relationship between the parties. And then you also want to cover a bunch of business terms. So who owns the intellectual property of all of this stuff being created by the owners? Normally the company will. Protection of confidential information. So that's, the company is going to have a lot of confidential information. And ideally, you don't want the members out there spilling the beans to people. And then a bunch of business restrictions. So things like non-solicitation of employees, non-solicitation of clients. You might have a non-compete provision in there, depending on the dynamics of the parties, but just a whole bunch of stuff of what you can and cannot do as an owner of the company. Let me hop to questions before I move forward. There's a lot of questions coming through. I'm going to try to hit all of them. I may not be able to. And if I can't, I'll have my email address at the end of this presentation where you can shoot me an email. I'd be happy to chat further. Are EINs interchangeable? If I started something years ago and still have an EIN, can I operate under the same EIN? Probably not. So an EIN is assigned usually to a company, but I think it can be assigned to people, but that's a whole different world. So Venture Legal got an EIN. If I were to shut down Venture Legal and start a new business in 5 years, no, I don't want to use that EIN. That EIN identifies my business. If I stop practicing law and just kind of go dormant for a few years, and then I come back 5 years later and reopen Venture Legal, as long as it's the same business entity, then yeah, you can keep using the same EIN. I also think you can apply and get a new one for the same business, although I'll be honest, I don't know what the scope of that is. I would say if you have a complicated issue here, you should probably talk to an accountant because that's really outside the scope of my expertise. Somebody said, if I relocate to another state, do I keep the LLC where it's registered, or should I register a new one in the new state? That's a really great question. Um, you have two options there. You can shut down your LLC. Let's say you're moving from Missouri to Kansas. I actually have clients do this all the time, going back and forth. Open up in Missouri, you live in Missouri, you work in Missouri, but then you move over to Kansas. You can keep your Missouri company, your LLC, alive in Missouri, and it will forever be an LLC registered in Missouri. When you get to Kansas, you can register that LLC as a foreign business, which actually I'll come back to in a second. Or you can shut down the Missouri company and open up a new company in Kansas. There's positives and negatives to both of those approaches, and there's a lot of factors you have to look into to decide which one of those makes the most sense for you. Unfortunately, I can't give a very good answer here because it just depends. That's lawyers love the answer, it depends, because everything always depends. But that's kind of the best advice I can give. Some states have a way to move an LLC from one state to the other, depending on the state laws. Unfortunately, Missouri and Kansas don't blend together in that regard. And then there's one last option. You could form a new LLC in Kansas and then merge your Missouri entity into that Kansas entity, but that gets a lot more complicated. But anyway, there are options to doing it. You would really just need to talk to a lawyer and probably an accountant before you do that. Somebody asked, is it difficult to change from a sole proprietorship to an LLC? No, generally no. Forming an LLC, like I said earlier, is super easy. The filing fees are super cheap. It's more of a practical issue. If you have lease agreements, client agreements, subcontractor agreements, vendor agreements, accounts with Stripe or Xero, FreshBooks, whatever, it's more of an administrative hassle to update everything. But because I think LLCs are so useful for freelancers, I would say do it. And the sooner you do it, the better, because if you wait 5 years, it's a lot harder because then you have a lot more contracts and accounts to update. But no, it's not that hard. And I'll talk about taxes here in just a second. Taxes from an LLC for a freelancer are pretty much the same as a sole proprietorship. I'm going to have to skip some of these questions because there's a lot of questions coming in. And I don't have time yet, but if I have time at the end, I promise I'll come back to these. So maintaining an LLC, and I'm going to kind of fly through some of these topics because I don't want to waste a ton of time talking about them. But if you have an LLC or a corporation, it's really important that you treat it separate from you. And this is especially true for freelancers. You need to open up a business bank account, use that account for everything, have your money come into that account, pay yourself out of the account, buy MacBooks and so on with that account. You need to register in foreign states if you have a nexus in those foreign states. So if you operate in Missouri, but you go to Kansas twice a week to meet with clients, or certainly if you have employees in Kansas, you would want to register in Kansas as a foreign entity doing business in that state. You also need to file annual reports, and Kansas requires these. They're $20 a year. I think you can do it $40 every other year now. And again, go to the Secretary of State website, look up your LLC, and you can file it online. Missouri does not require annual reports for LLCs. But both states do require it for corporations. And then make sure you renew your DBAs. Again, Kansas doesn't have a DBA database, but Missouri does. Missouri requires you to renew them. I think it's every 5 years. Regardless, when you register, you'll see what the deadline is on the form. Okay, we're going to move into business and taxes here in a second. I'm going to check to see if there's any other quick questions that would be relevant to answer. What's the difference between having a solopreneurship versus an LLC? So sole proprietorship is just me, right? I say, my name's Chris Brown. I'm going to offer you a service. You're going to pay me a check or pay me cash. And I take that money, I put it in my personal bank account, and it's me. All right. It's fairly simple. The downside is I'm personally liable for everything that happens through my business, if you will. So if I have subcontractors or employees or anybody else doing work for me, I'm going to be personally liable for all of that stuff. But by forming an LLC, and I went through this a little bit earlier, you get limited liability. So you're still going to be liable for the things you do, but you can limit your liability with respect to what other people are doing on your behalf for your clients. And you can also limit your liability with respect to contracts that your LLC signs. So it's usually a good idea to form an LLC. If you are doing 1 or 2 projects a year, may not be worth it. Once you start doing this, more than a couple hours a week, it's probably worth it to file. But it's kind of different for everybody. Okay, business taxes 101. Uh, there's two basic ways that the IRS will tax businesses. The main way that most businesses are taxed is what's called pass through. The other way is what's called double tax. And these are informal words, they're not actually in the IRS regs. But pass through entities are like sole proprietorships and partnerships. And when I say partnership, I include in that LLCs. You'll notice that LLC is not listed in this list of business types because an LLC is unique in that it can choose how it wants to be taxed. So if you're a pass-through entity, if you're a single member LLC taxed like a sole proprietorship, or if you are an LLC taxed as a partnership because there's more than one of you, two or three or four or whatever, you'll be passed through. What that means is that the money the business brings in will flow through to your personal tax return. The company itself will not pay income taxes. Uh, Partnerships have to file an informational return with the IRS. Sole proprietorships do not have to file that return, but in either event, the company itself does not pay taxes. The owners, whether it's one person, two people, or whatever, pay taxes on their personal tax return at their personal income tax rate. So let's just say Amy and Brad want to start a business. Let's say that, Amy makes, 50 grand through the business and Brad makes 50 grand through the business because it's 50-50, right? But let's say Brad has a wife who has a job, getting paid $500,000 a year. So Brad's income tax bracket might be 40%. And Amy's income tax bracket might be 20% because her only income is the LLC income. So she'll pay taxes at 20%, but Brad will pay taxes at 40%. The point here is it's all on your personal tax return. It's not through the business. It literally passes through the business. Conversely, you've got corporations, and corporations are taxed in a structure known as double tax, and it's exactly what the name implies. If your business makes money, the business itself will pay income tax. The corporate tax rate is like 20, 30%, something like that. After the business makes its money and pays its taxes, it will issue dividends to the owners. And at that time, the owners have to pay taxes on the dividends. So if you make 100 grand in a pass-through entity, you might end up with, say, 80 grand profit after taxes. If you make 100 grand in a double tax entity like a corporation, you might end up with like 60 grand. So there's a huge difference there. That's another reason why a lot of people choose to be an LLC, because they can be an LLC taxed as a partnership or a sole proprietorship. Now, this gets extremely deep in the weeds, and this is extremely a high level overview. There's also a concept called S corporations. And the important thing I want to note here is that S corporations are not a business entity. An S corporation is just a tax election that you can make as an LLC or as a corporation. I can't remember if sole proprietorships can do it or not, but in either event, sole proprietorships usually should be an LLC in my opinion. So you can make an S corp election to reduce your tax liability, but getting into that's kind of outside the scope of this presentation. I have a 3-part blog post series on my website, venturelegalkc.com, if you want to know about how S corps work. If you are a pass-through entity, you're a sole proprietorship or a partnership, or you are taxed as one of those two, then here's some strategies for maintaining your tax payments to the government, making sure you don't get upside down. First thing, save 15 to 30% of your profit. So in your first year or two, this is hard, I'll be honest. And in fact, when I first started my own business, it was difficult to figure out how much to save versus how much to pay myself. But generally speaking, you want to save between 15 and 30% of your profits. I recommend you set up a special savings account, either in your name or in the LLC name, it doesn't really matter, where you put 15 to 30% of your profits on a regular basis. So I do it every other Monday, where I move a certain amount of money over to my savings account to make sure I always have money there to pay my tax liability. Second step is to pay your estimated taxes quarterly. It's roughly every 3 months, but not exactly every 3 months. And then at the end of the year, you will attach a Schedule C or a K1, depending on how you're taxed, to your personal tax return. That document will tell the IRS, I made X number of dollars and I owe you Y number of dollars. And if you've already paid estimated taxes throughout the year, you may not owe anything. You actually might get a refund. But if you underpaid throughout the year, then you'll end up owing more money come tax season. I see, let's see here, question come through. If you serve as a subcontractor or a freelance for someone else's LLC, do you report that income? You only report the income that comes to you. So let's just say that I hire a paralegal as an independent contractor. That paralegal's only tax obligation is to report and pay taxes on the amount of money that I pay to her. It doesn't matter how much money I bring in from my client. All that matters to her is how much I paid her. If I pay her more than $600 a year, then I will issue what's called a 1099 to the IRS. And literally all that form is to tell the IRS, hey, I paid my paralegal, say $5,000 this year. The IRS will take that form and match it up to the paralegal's income tax return to see if she actually reported that $5,000 of income. And if she didn't, they'll send her nasty letters saying pay up. If she did, everything's good. But anyway, she would only have to report that $5,000 of income as the subcontractor, if you will. A few other tips here on finance. It's really important that you find a bank that works the way that you like to work. And what I mean by that is, do they have a good iPhone app? If you want to bank remotely, make sure they have good technology or at least a good website. If you really care about customer service or if you need to take out loans, make sure you talk to their lending staff and make sure that they work the way you want to work. Use a cloud-based accounting platform. I usually recommend Xero or FreshBooks to most people, and it's Xero with an Xero.com. These cloud platforms are awesome. You can grant your accountant access to them so they can see all of your financial information when tax time comes around. And also, it's just way better than doing an Excel file or putting everything in a shoebox. And then track your income and expenses consistently and regularly. I do this every other Monday, so I'm never too far behind. And also that helps me to kind of have an idea of, how I'm doing financially throughout the year. What you don't want to do is wait until the end of the year or until tax season to start compiling all of your expense reports and all that stuff, because it'll just be a total disaster. You really should try to do this at least a couple times a month, or at least monthly, I'd say. Okay, so we got, let's see, 12 minutes left. We're gonna fly through a bunch of just random practical business thoughts in terms of starting a business and some extra things you should think about. First one is insurance. Insurance is your first line of defense. If somebody sues you, it's really nice to have an insurance policy there to not only pay for your legal defense, but also to pay for the damages that might be assessed against you. And there's a lot of different kinds of insurance. You've got commercial general liability insurance, which is generally like physical property damage, usually. Professional liability insurance, E&O insurance. It's sometimes called E&O for errors and omissions. And this is for people who are providing a professional service. Lawyers have a special form of insurance called malpractice insurance. But like if you're doing marketing strategy, creative work, that you would typically buy professional liability to insure you against mistakes that you might make in your professional capacity. Auto insurance, there's commercial and hired and non-owned insurance policies. There's different kinds you can get there if your business involves driving around. And then there's a whole bunch of other stuff. There's employer liability, cyber liability, data breach privacy liability. There's all these types of insurance. Depending on your client base and depending on what you're doing, you may or may not need all of these. The biggest practical issue is when you're a freelancer and you get a contract with a big company, like a Fortune 500 company, they always want you to buy all these expensive insurance policies. And sometimes it's just not worth it to buy it just for that one client. So sometimes you just turn the client down. Other times you'll just increase your rate that you're charging the client to cover the expense of the insurance. In either event, when you start your business, if you have any risk out there at all, every business has risk, I guess, but talk to a insurance broker and they can assess what risk you have and recommend policies. Contracts. I love contracts. I'm a lawyer. I'm a geeky, dorky lawyer, and I love contracts. Tip number one, always get them in writing. Yes, oral contracts are enforceable in a lot of situations, but you're better off almost always having it in writing. If nothing else, use an email exchange. Be smart about your contract templates. So if you do create your own templates or you find your templates online, just make sure they're good templates. if you get a big contract, let's say you get a freelancing gig with Cerner, or your company becomes a Cerner vendor, and Cerner sends you their default contract. You don't want to just turn around and use that contract with all of your clients, because that contract is going to be 100% in favor of Cerner because they have the bargaining power to do that. You just want to make sure that you're using a template that is aligned with how you do business. Read everything in the contract. Don't just skim them. There's always little things hidden here and there. Um, Always review termination rights. Make sure you understand how you can get out of the contract, as well as how your client or the other party can get out of the contract, especially in times of COVID. Review the force majeure language to make sure you understand, how both sides can get out in the event of a force majeure, such as COVID. I've talked more about force majeure this year than I've ever talked about in my legal career. Don't be afraid to negotiate. If there's something in the contract that is just wrong or that doesn't align with your expectations, raise the issue. Very rarely will the other side just say, you know what, screw it, I'm walking away. They might tell you no, but there's no harm in trying to get terms that are more fitting for your relationship. And then last, make sure you sign them correctly. And what I mean by that is this screen here. You should just take a screenshot probably. If you're an individual, if you're a sole proprietor, if Chris Brown goes out there and offers services under my name, you would just literally sign it just like that, Chris Brown. That's it. If you're a business, it's way more important that you follow this format here. And you'll note this is how the format works. You've got your business name. In this case, it's all fake, but Brown Enterprises LLC. Sign the contract, print your name, print your title. By doing it with this format, you are almost ensuring that the contract will be between your LLC and the other party, and not you as an individual. Checking questions. I don't think I see any. Okay, so non-disclosure agreements. Lots of companies nowadays have tons of confidential information that they need to protect. So if you are presented with an NDA, or if you're going to give one to somebody else, here are some thoughts. First, you need to consider if it's unilateral or mutual. And what I mean by that is it binding on both parties, or is it only one way? If you go to work for Cerner as a contractor, for example, or a vendor, you will have to agree to protect their information. But odds of them protecting your confidential information are pretty slim unless you have a decent amount of bargaining power to fight for that. Consider the obligations. There's usually an obligation to protect the confidential information, an obligation not to disclose it to third parties, and an obligation not to use it for your own private benefit if it's not for the benefit of the other party. Also think about what is confidential. There's a lot of different ways you can define that, as well as what's not confidential. So that's what I mean by exceptions. What are the exceptions to that definition? There also might be exceptions to the obligations. So a common exception is if a party is in a lawsuit and a court requires them to disclose it, then they're allowed to under certain circumstances. And then also consider the length of the obligation. Sometimes it's 1 year, commonly it's 5 to 10 years. Sometimes you'll see a perpetual obligation, which lasts forever. It just kind of depends on the circumstances of the parties. Commercial lease agreements. If you are going to be leasing space, my best tip is the bottom line there, where it says co-working is a great first step. Co-working is a great way to get into a lease agreement that doesn't require a long-term commitment. The rental amount is usually low. I usually recommend that for most businesses, but sometimes you just need a physical space. If you're a retail outlet, or if you, if you print T-shirts or whatever, and you just need space, then you'll need to sign a commercial lease agreement. In that case, you just need to make sure you understand what risk you're taking on. They usually have extremely long terms, 5 years, 7 years, or whatever. They're very hard to get out. And a lot of them will require that the tenant will pay for pretty much everything, taxes, insurance, maintenance, all that stuff. It's what's called triple net. And the biggest catch is to make sure that you're not signing a personal guarantee, or if you are signing it, to make sure that you understand what that means. If your LLC signs a lease agreement with a landlord and you sign a personal guarantee, that means that you were personally liable for everything that happens through that company or through that lease agreement. And there's some serious risk there. So just consider that before you sign it. And then the last thing I'm going to go through here before I jump into questions will be website terms. More and more companies are operating online, providing SaaS solutions and things. In this case, you often won't have contracts with your users in the traditional sense, but rather you'll have terms of service. This is like the greatest lie on the internet, right? Everybody signs up for Facebook, YouTube, whatever, clicks I agree. If you read those, raise your hand. I actually read most of that stuff. Not so much because I want to try to negotiate it, but because I'm just curious how various companies are doing it, because trends change. But anyway, if you're operating an app, an online service where people can create accounts, certainly if you're operating a service where you're selling stuff or where people can upload content, you'll need to have a good privacy policy as well as terms of service. Depending on the way your service works, you might have order forms that just refer back to your terms of service. But in either event, this is a contract. It's a contract between you and your user base. And it's really important to have. So consider that. I also have a bunch of content, blog posts, and so on my website about website terms. That's everything. That's how to start a business, finance, and practical business thoughts in 42 minutes. We've got 3 minutes. Does anybody have any more questions? I don't know if I see any over here, but I don't think so. It doesn't look like it. To be honest, I don't know what happens next. Caitlin, I don't know if you come back out or if this session is just over. With in either event, here's my contact information. Feel free to shoot me an email if you have any questions whatsoever. I'm also on Twitter at CSB Counsel, and I tweet a lot about legal issues, access to justice issues, and just kind of the future of the legal industry as well as entrepreneurship. So that pretty much wraps it up.